This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by Saturn Run, a new novel from #1 New York Times bestselling and Pulitzer Prize-winning author John Sanford, and internationally known photo artist and science fiction aficionado Katine. Saturn Run is a near-future thriller about astronauts racing to reach a mysterious alien spacecraft as it approaches Saturn. The book has drawn praise from authors such as Stephen King and science fiction legend Larry Niven. Learn more at johnsanford.org/saturnrun.html.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 170 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show we'll be discussing the history of Dungeons & Dragons, and I'm joined by two guests. So first up we've got David Ewalt. He's a contributing editor at Forbes magazine, and he blogs about games and technology for Forbes.com. He's also written for New York Magazine and The Wall Street Journal, and he's appeared as a guest on NPR, CNN, and MSNBC. His first book, Of Dice and Men, The Story of Dungeons & Dragons and the People Who Play It, was chosen by Amazon.com as one of the best books of 2013. So David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And also joining us today is Michael Witwer. He's a film and theater actor and marketing professional, and also the brother of actor Sam Witwer, who first introduced him to Dungeons & Dragons. He holds degrees from Northwestern University and the University of Chicago, where he wrote his master's thesis on Dungeons & Dragons. That thesis formed the basis for his new book Empire of Imagination, Gary Gygax and the Birth of Dungeons & Dragons. So Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
And today's show is brought to you by the new novel Saturn Run, a unique partnership between #1 best-selling thriller writer John Sanford and internationally known photographer and science fiction geek Katine. Sanford is the author of 37 best-selling thriller novels, and this new book will appeal to fans of science fiction thrillers like The Martian. And here's a synopsis. It says, "The year is 2066. A Caltech intern inadvertently notices an anomaly from a space telescope. Something is approaching Saturn and decelerating. Space objects don't decelerate. Spaceships do. A flurry of top-level government meetings produces the inescapable conclusion. Whatever built that ship is at least 100 years ahead in hard and soft technology, and whoever can get their hands on it will have an advantage so large no other nation can compete. The race is on, and a remarkable adventure begins, an epic tale of courage, treachery, resourcefulness, and astonishing human and technological discovery, as the members of a hastily thrown-together crew find their strength and wits tested against adversaries both of this Earth and beyond." Science fiction legend Larry Niven praises the book as a terrific story of alien first contact, and Stephen King calls it a book Michael Crichton would have enjoyed but never could have written. He didn't have Sanford's gift of good humor and his uncanny ear for dialogue. With the able partnership of Katine, it's fast, scientifically believable, and peopled by characters who become good friends. So again, the book is called Saturn Run, and it goes on sale October 6th. And you can learn more at johnsanford.org/saturnrun.html. Okay, and so as I mentioned, today on the show we'll be discussing the history of Dungeons & Dragons. So first off, let's talk about our history with playing the game. So Michael, why don't you go first and just tell us about how you started playing D&D?
Sure. I started well before the ages they recommend you start playing D&D. I was probably 5 or 6 years old. And there was a neighborhood boy that was selling his D&D books. And this is kind of in the height of the satanic panic, call it the mid-'80s, somewhere in there. And so my brother got word of this. And so he convinced my dad to go over and buy this 2-foot-high stack of D&D books, late 70s, early 80s D&D books. So we all go over there, and I even remember the amount. My dad paid $80 for the books, which was probably quite a deal looking back on it. And so we took him home. You know, my brother started kind of reading through this otherwise esoteric and controversial game. And of course, we were his guinea pigs, really. We didn't have much of a choice. So it was me and my best friend, Nick, as 5 or 6 year olds. And we were trying to muddle our ways through. My recollection is the first adventure was The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, which was an AD&D venture from the late 70s. So that's when I all started, and I've been playing ever since.
Huh. Well, so you mentioned the satanic panic. Was that connected to why this other kid was selling all his D&D books, or like why was he selling them?
No connection. He was in early high school, and I think he had kind of outgrown it, in quotes. So we were kind of the beneficiaries of him kind of losing the interest.
And those were the first edition AD&D books?
That's correct. Mostly, yes. Most of the modules were, yeah. A lot of second printing, I should say second edition of the core books. So these were like the Jeff Easley covers, a lot of the books that I grew up with, vintage 1983.
And did you have any kind of particular character that you like to play?
I'm pretty sure I was a fighter back then. I mean, I've come a long way since then. But of course, for starting the game, I'm quite certain we were both fighters, and we were reckless and bloodthirsty. I mean, there was no other way about it. And really, the way it usually went was my friend and I were, again, really kind of too young to be playing the game. So we're kind of out there. We're just kind of like killing anyone we could find. And usually what would happen is my brother would get very annoyed with our gameplay and then turn our otherwise helpless victims into monsters that would dispatch us. So that was usually how it went early on. And again, we played D&D for a long time, and I actually ended up moving into West End games, Star Wars. We played Star Wars for years, a couple different iterations, West End, and then later Wizards, and then a lot of D&D. Matter of fact, I played every edition except for 5th, so which I'm still hankering to play this December. So.
All right, cool. And how about David? Why don't you tell us about how you got into Dungeons & Dragons?
It's funny hearing Michael's story because, mine is fairly similar. I think there's always a big brother in these origin stories somewhere. In my story, it was a friend of mine, his big brother, my friend Scott. I was guessing 4th grade, so that makes you, 10 years old? His big brother had these cool books, and I'm over at Scott's house, and Scott's like, hey, check this out, and brings over these weird hardcover books with pictures of monsters on them, and we start flipping through them, and there's even cooler pictures inside, and all these amazing drawings of different pole arms and weapons and stuff. And so we got our friends together and started doing our own games. We didn't have an experienced dungeon master. We were kind of learning it as we went, but it very quickly became our most favorite activity. Where we'd hang out in a group with all these kids, we'd play D&D, and we got some different campaigns going. From D&D, we started to discover all other role-playing games. Back then, it was things like Top Secret. But then, as we got older, started playing games like Shadowrun I played a lot of, and Cyberpunk 2020, and then later on all of White Wolf stuff. So it was kind of a constant presence in my childhood, up from elementary school up until high school, playing all these different role-playing games, starting with D&D.
Mm-hmm. And was that first edition that you played the most?
That was, I think the first game we played was from the basic set. The first adventure I remember playing was the Keep on the Borderlands, which was in that classic red box D&D set. And I think that's probably more than any other adventure. That's probably what most people started with, because it was in that introductory box. But then mostly what we played was Advanced D&D. For many years, we had different campaigns running in that first edition AD&D.
Mm-hmm. But so that first one, the red box, that was even before Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Right?
Oh yeah, that's that basic D&D.
And did you have a particular kind of character you played a lot?
I had lots of different characters. One of the things that's really appealing to me about the game that was then, still is now, is the character creation process. And so a lot of times when I couldn't get together for friends, I would just make characters. So I feel like every time we played, I probably whipped out a different character. I was like, oh, I want to try this one now. Wizards, fighters, thieves, paladins, you name it. I was always whipping up a new character and wanted to play it.
Well, so tell us, what was it about Dungeons & Dragons now that made you want to write a whole book about it?
Well, it was a couple of things. One is that these role-playing games were very important to me when I was younger, and played them a lot, through elementary school and high school, and then sort of stopped playing when I went off to college. And I missed it, but, never really got back into the hobby. And then when I got older, I went to journalism, I started writing about technology, and then increasingly started writing about the video game business. And as I was learning that beat and meeting people who make video games, I would meet designers and I would meet executives, and I always like to ask people, what made you want to do this for a living? Like, why did you decide that you want to make video games? And over again, they gave me the same answer. They all said, oh, I played a lot of Dungeons & Dragons when I was a kid. And so that really got me thinking, like, you know what, it wasn't just me. I wasn't the only person obsessed with this game when I was a kid, and not the only person that really felt like it changed them and really helped, turn them into the person they are today. It was important to a lot of people. And so that got me really looking at, well, what is this game? Where did it come from? What's the history? But also just, what's the real social impact, and what's, the economic impact and the business impact, like just how much did this game change the world? And so that was really what prompted the book.
Yeah. And I mean, your book, it's kind of an interesting mix of the history of Dungeons & Dragons and then your personal journey as a player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to make the book accessible to people who had never played D&D before. And I felt like, well, if I just do a history, a straight sort of journalistic nonfiction history, I want people like my mom to read this. And number one, there's a story in there, that they can relate to. Here's a person. But also, I want to be able to explain how the game feels. It's one thing to sort of say, here's the rote history. Here's A happened, then B happened, then C happened. But D&D is one of these things, if you've never played it, people have a real hard time sort of conceptualizing what it is. So a lot of what I put into the book was, here's what the games felt like. Like, this is what it looks like at the table. This is what people are doing. No, we're not necessarily wearing costumes. Or no, this is how the actual turns work. And this is, what people say. And this is what the dungeon master says. And really, I wanted to make people feel like they were sitting there at the table. Right.
Well, so Michael, tell us about your book, because I mentioned that it started out as a thesis project. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. I was in this master's program, University of Chicago, and I hit a total dead end with my existing thesis, which I've been working on for like a year. I mean, I was down a rabbit hole. It had to do with like Mayan urban planning, blah. So I was really thinking long and hard about what can I do in this program. One of my things, this was just a personal thing, but I wanted to do something that hadn't been done. So I was, which is of course very hard to do as a thesis for anything. Is not only trying to get it done, but actually do something that hadn't been done before. And I was, I've been working in marketing and product marketing really for a long, long time, and I was just kind of hitting a dead end in a lot of ways. And I tripped on this article about Gary Gygax, and brought back a flood of memories because, of course, I continue to play role playing games to this day. So we've always played with some regularity. Ever since I was little, all the way up till now. Even if some regularity means like once a year and like a week-long mancation session in a house we rent somewhere. So I tricked on this article, and Gygax, to me, being from Chicago, was always kind of a shadowy character. I didn't know a lot about him. I knew he had created the game, or he was the co-creator, to be exact, of the game. And he was, of course, right from up the road from where I grew up, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And I just didn't know a lot about the character, but I knew he was kind of revered. He was legendary or whatever. And what occurred to me, even when I read this first article, and this, of course, is an article after he had since passed, of course, in 2008, was that, wow, this guy led a really interesting life. It was kind of this biographical article. And he just led this really interesting life. And it occurred to me that it was almost as dynamic and interesting as all of the very well-publicized stuff around the game and the company, TSR. He had this kind of rags to riches to rags story, with all kinds of high points and low points. And so his story alone got me quite engaged and interested in the idea of, wow, I wonder if anyone's ever taken on a biography about this guy, Gary Gygax. And I was really surprised to learn that no one had. There was no biography about this fella. And the more I thought about it, the more I kept looking around, and someone who had grown up role-playing gaming, I keep seeing all of these huge phenomena in pop culture that are huge. Everything from MMOs, of course, to aspects of social media, to first-person shooters and computer role-playing games, you name it, multi-billion-dollar stuff. And a lot of this stuff owns at least some of its roots and some of its origins to tabletop role-playing. So I really start to think about, like, wow, this is a really important guy. Way too important, frankly, not to have a biography. And again, I'm still thinking in terms of a master's project, keep in mind, not so much a book biography, but I still wanted to do something that hadn't been done. I thought, well, this is a cool idea. And so, as I grew into this project and as I started to kind of examine the feasibility of it and the accessibility of it, I kind of came to this conclusion that, really, he's like one of the most important people out there that very few people have ever really heard of or know about. I mean, we live in an era when it is chic to be geek. I think we, to a certain extent, we can all agree on that it's somehow become, in vogue to be geek. And here's the guy that created what a lot of people define as the epitome of geekdom, Dungeons and Dragons. And so, so by kind of the transitive property, Gary Gygax is like as important today as he ever was. And then I kind of started getting into, a lot of aspects of how I might approach the project. And as David was talking about, I really think it's really fun to hear what he has to say, because he and I obviously think very similarly about this topic, in that accessibility was a very, very important thing to me. And we approached it very differently. He approached it through kind of telling these stories and trying to, get into the head of the role player. One thing I did stylistically was really try to get you into the head of Gary to a certain extent, and to make him as relatable as you can, to really kind of walk with him and to really celebrate his victories with him, and kind of mourn over his defeats. So that's kind of how it all started. That's probably going a little bit deep for that answer, but does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and like you said, the form of your book is really interesting, because kind of each chapter is sort of an episode in the life of Gary Gygax, and it's written like almost like a novel where you're inside his head and it's following him moment by moment. How much of that did you draw from research, and how much of it was kind of your own imagination?
Good question. I mean, I made sure everything had really rigorous foundational research. I didn't want to just be making stuff up. I mean, obviously, it's a nonfiction piece, but I was really very, very inspired about a lot of the narrative nonfiction writers out there. Eric Larson's probably my favorite. To a certain extent, I think Ben Mesrick does a lot of interesting things as well. He's a lot looser with history. I want it to be a lot more. I shouldn't say that. I think he pushes the envelope a lot more than, say, Eric Larson does. I wanted to find a happy medium between those two, because I really did want this book to read like a novel but be a nonfiction piece. So, I went to a lot of trouble to make sure that I was, really, recreating events as best as I possibly could, even everything down to kind of what the rooms looked like and that level of detail. And to really try to express these events as the spirit of the event. I can't tell you that Gary was thinking exactly this, or even he even said exactly that. But I tried to give a lot, as many devices as I could to the reader, to make sure that they knew what was kind of imagined or editorialized from my standpoint, and what came out of someone's mouth. So I would use accounts that had dialogue. If somebody told an account where he said, "And then I said this," well, I might use that exact quote and then have a citation next to it and give you an end note to kind of tell you that this is what this person said, or this is where this account comes from. I guess the best way I would put it is that while there were certainly liberties taken in certain scene to scene, no one could ever really know what this person was thinking or what exactly was said in this room that no one else but these two people were in. But I was 100% true to the legend and the legacy, you might say, of Gary Gygax.
Yeah. Well, so David, I mean, like Michael was saying, that I feel the same way as he was saying, that I grew up just being enthralled by Dungeons and Dragons, and just, the name Gary Gygax was just magical to me. But until I read your guys' book, I really didn't know anything about him at all. And I didn't even really know that he was such a pivotal figure in the wargaming scene, even before Dungeons and Dragons came about. Could you just talk a little bit about the wargaming scene that kind of gave birth to Dungeons and Dragons?
Yeah, it's funny how, people who are really into D&D and play it every week, they certainly know the name Gary Gygax and revere him in a lot of ways, but are, surprised to really find out who he was and the story behind him. The wargaming thing is sort of the environment that D&D was born out of. In my book, I go way back, I go all the way back to ancient versions of chess and stuff like that, and sort of say these are the primitive progenitors of Dungeons and Dragons, because essentially with games like chess and later war games like Kriegspiel and some of these other big games where you're fighting armies on a battlefield, what those games were doing is they're trying to simulate warfare, fighting, come up with a quantified way where you can have some rules and roll some dice and simulate this sort of martial experience. And that's what D&D grew out of. Gary Gygax and his friends in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and also around the United States and the world were part of this community that grew in the United States, really started taking off in the 50s and 60s into the early 70s, where people would play these games like Kriegspiel, where I've got 10 soldiers on a battlefield and I'm pushing them around a table and we're simulating these historical battles. And Gary and some of his friends started taking us a little bit further and saying, well, if we're going to be controlling these armies, what if instead of just having these armies on the table, what if we're controlling kingdoms? And each of us is the king of our own little kingdom. And so they started designing this whole world, they call it the Great Kingdom, of, okay, well, this is one area of the world over here where there's this kingdom and this duchy, and this is where these armies come from, and this is, where we're going to have these battles. And they sketched out these maps and built this sort of consensual world together. And then they experimented even further, where they started saying, well, instead of just having these games where we're controlling entire armies, what if, we were just controlling a single character? I don't want to control 400 knights. I just want to control one knight. And from there, the game evolved. It was really, a collaborative effort through lots of these different wargamers, and particularly a collaborative effort between Gary Gygax and his partner Dave Arneson, who really created the original D&D rules and the original D&D concept. But that whole idea of, okay, yeah, we're going to have a character who's like a warrior of some type, and that we're going to control what that person does, that grew out of, looking at a table full of tin figures and saying, I don't want to be a whole army. I just want to be one of these guys.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I even as a kid, I guess I'd heard a little bit that there was this Gygax-Arneson schism, but I never knew too much about it. But the takeaway I got from your book was it really seemed that Dave Arneson was the one who had the big conceptual breakthrough, but Gary Gygax was the one who was able to actually make that into a game and market it. Is that a fair way of putting it?
That I don't want to take away from the stuff that Gary did invent. This would have never happened without Gary. But there's a few crucial things where you can point to one person or another. It does seem that Dave Arneson, really was the first person to come up with the whole idea of we're going to explore a dungeon and, we're having our characters go into this fantastic, these catacombs under a castle, and we're going to fight monsters and look for treasure. Gary, however, helped come up with the rules for fantasy combat, for having heroic characters. That was, the stuff that Dave Arneson and his friends based their rules on. So they really fed off of each other. It couldn't have happened without both of them. And then especially couldn't have happened without Gary's sort of vision and genius for Dungeons and Dragons as a product. Dave Arneson may have just come up with this fun game that he played with his friends for a while, and other people would have enjoyed it. But it was really Gary who was the visionary and said, you know what, this is something other people want to play and other people will pay for, and let's make a product out of this. Let's make books out of this. Let's start a company. And that's where I feel like Gary's true genius came through. It was there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Michael, do you want to say anything about the sort of conflicts between these guys? Because, I as a kid, I think I always imagined if, everyone involved with Dungeons & Dragons must be awesome and they just must go to work with giant smiles on their face every day. And it's sort of, it's kind of shocking to me to learn how much dissension there was. But in your book, you go into a lot about the personalities of these guys and what they were like. Do you just want to say kind of what they were like as people and how they got along with each other?
Yeah, I think... you had a lot of very, very creative people hanging out together who not one of them was a good businessman for the most part. While they, just like, a lot of people that, run shops that are a labor of love, that's absolutely what was happening here. So there were people that, Gary had been designing games, pulling all-nighters, doing this on a pro bono basis for years and years and years, and had worked on all of the component pieces that made up a role-playing game to a certain extent. So when he and Arneson got together and kind of put this thing together, and David is exactly right. Arneson was the first guy, I think, that you could say played something that really kind of resembled what we would recognize as a role-playing game functionally with his group. The thing I give Gary an awful lot of credit for, I give Gary a lot of credit for a lot of things. One of them, though, is, of course, that Arneson is basing a lot of these concepts on component pieces that Gary created or that Gary had based on other work. So it was platform technology, really. Again, you could get really in the weeds about Arneson having based some of these concepts on Dave Wesley's, Brownstein. And, there was a lot of people working together kind of creating really interesting stuff. But when it got into a business situation, they really had a product that was was so great. They really just didn't know what to do with it other than, keep creating games, try to keep kind of the grist mill running, as Gary would put it. And what it came right down to it is once kind of success hit, once they really started selling this game, they all kind of figured out that they didn't, I shouldn't say they figured out they didn't know what they're doing, but that kind of proved to be the case. Gary and Arneson never necessarily got along great, even during their collaborations, because they were very different types. Arneson was hyper creative, but he was very shoot from the hip, and he could really run a hell of a game, but it wouldn't be based on what was necessarily written on a page. I mean, he was kind of improvising a lot of things. He was keeping kind of personal notes and fly by night type stuff. Gary was very structured, as David already suggested. He came from this tradition of wargaming and miniatures and diplomacy, I should mention, which is kind of a third component that was a root of foundational gaming type that kind of led to role playing also. But Gary was very interested in rules, and if you read some of his early role playing writing, I mean, it's unbelievably detailed. I mean, he tries to leave as little to chance as he possibly can. And some of the earliest OD&D stuff, original D&D stuff, are mechanics that we wouldn't necessarily recognize today as role playing. And I'll give you one example. It's recommended in the original Dungeons and Dragons that you use a caller for your group. That is a person that takes the actions of your entire group and proclaims them all to the dungeon master, or at that point, the referee. So, I guess to answer your question on the big scope is that these guys didn't know they were doing great things. They were having fun and they were playing games that they wanted to play. And all of a sudden, they've got this hit on their hands. And I think they had a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to react to it. And so by 76, when Arneson actually starts at TSR and leaves 10 months later, it's really more theory than fact about exactly what happened there, other than the fact that they really didn't get along. Gary was probably somehow disappointed by Arneson's output, or maybe he was suppressing Arneson. It's hard to say. But again, it became a pretty dysfunctional work situation pretty quickly in a lot of ways. And I get a lot into that, of course, into the 80s. As he takes on other partners, as he brings in other people, it just gets to be a very complicated business.
Right. Well, I mean, David, do you want to add anything to that? Because what's so heartbreaking from my point of view reading this story is, just like it was like they needed money to print the game initially. It was like $1,000 or $2,000 or something. And that seed money seems to have kind of laid the doom for the whole company.
Yeah, I think Michael said it really well that, these guys were not business geniuses. It is, the story of TSR, the parent company that published Dungeons and Dragons, is in a lot of ways a really tragic story because it's, it's a business that's founded on passions. In their, when the company first starts and they're printing these games, they're printing their own magazine too. And the magazine exists to sort of have some new rules in it and little game stuff, but there's an editorial in every issue of the magazine. And the first couple issues of that magazine are so sort of tragic to read because it's all talking about how, like, our goals as a company are to be by gamers for gamers, and they're really dedicated to this cause, and they want to, serve their fellows. But when D&D starts to catch on and all this money starts coming in, it was way more money than anybody could have ever anticipated, and they don't know what to do with it. And this causes interpersonal conflicts, this causes really bad business decisions, and the company just sort of goes out of control for a while and ultimately, meets its doom because of, these guys, these were guys who knew how to help you have a really good time. They were guys who knew how to run a good game. They were not guys who knew how to run a millions of dollars in revenue company. And there's some really interesting stuff that happened along the way in terms of, the business mistakes they made and what went wrong.
Right. And I mean, speaking of things spinning out of control, another thing that spun completely out of control was this whole satanic panic media frenzy, which just seems just so bizarre in retrospect. But talk about, like, how did that ever even become a thing?
Yeah, so that was, that was crazy. You have to think about it this way. So right now, if people play games right now, whether they're playing video games or whatever else, video games still get complaints. Like, there's news, every time a new Grand Theft Auto comes out, there's always some congressman who's like, this is disgusting, we need to ban this stuff. But this is after we've had video games for 30 years. Now imagine going back to the early 1970s, before, video games like that existed. A game like D&D was totally new, and it wasn't just that D&D was new. Nobody had ever made a game where you're the character, where you're controlling the hero in the game. That was brand new to people. So a lot of people just didn't understand what it was. And then the fact that this was a fantasy game in a fantasy setting, where you're casting spells, where you might be dealing with monsters, with witches, with demons. People saw that, and they didn't know what to think. You'd have parents and clergy and teachers picking up the player's handbook or the monster's manual in the 1970s and looking at it. They're not going to look at that and say, these are rules for a game. I understand what this is. They're going to pick that up and say, oh my God, this is a spell book. And people freaked out, completely unreasonably, but people freaked out and thought, this is satanic. What the hell has my kid gotten into? I don't know what this is. And then you started seeing things like some kids would, because the game was so popular, like lots of kids had it. They had a copy and did a player's handbook in their bedroom. And then if a kid got in trouble, let's say, a kid goes out and, robs a liquor store or crashes his car, whatever he does, if police then go back to his house and search him and search his room and find one of these books, a lot of them jump to this insane conclusion of, oh my God, this must be why this poor child went astray. Look at this demonic book he's got in his room. So it spun out of control, and it really became this whole phenomena of clergy and teachers and parents thinking that the game was bad, trying to ban it, and as you can imagine, put yourself in the place of a kid in the early 1980s who hears, hey, you really shouldn't play this game. This game is evil, and this game will give you magical powers, and you'll be able to summon demons and stuff. That's the most metal game I've ever heard. I want to play that game. And so that's what happened. The game just got more and more popular, and as it got more popular, the freak out got bigger and bigger, and they just sort of fed off of each other for years.
Well, and obviously, even as a kid, I knew the satanic stuff was ridiculous, but I guess I did have the sense that Gary Gygax was probably not the most devout person on earth. But then, Michael, reading your book, it turns out he's actually a Jehovah's Witness, and a fairly serious one.
Absolutely. Gary, certainly through the 60s and probably about halfway through the 70s, is a practicing Jehovah's Witness. I don't know if I would call him devout by Jehovah's Witness standards, but I can tell you this is a guy that was going, at least had periods of his life where he was going door to door and doing that type of evangelism. I remember speaking to Ernie, that Ernie, when he was a kid, he was going with his parents and doing this type of thing. I think his wife, Mary, was kind of more into it than he was, and I think she kind of definitely was kind of holding the torch in the family more than anybody. But Gary was serious, and if you read a lot of his early writings, especially in fanzines and stuff like that, you hear him say a lot of things, especially when they were more opinion-oriented. You'll hear him say a lot of things that are directly derivative of his faith, but people didn't necessarily know that. I remember one piece of writing where he, wrote to his friends how, nobody should celebrate Christmas because of this, and this. And they're actually tenets of Jehovah's Witness theology. But, he's kind of writing it, in his own style and from his own point of view. So Gary was definitely a practicing Jehovah's Witness, but that also didn't stop him from some of his other weaknesses, like smoking and drinking and whatnot, things that actually ended up alienating him from the local congregation. He's a very interesting character in many respects, because I think he was very much a believer in that faith for a period of time, but he definitely became disillusioned with it. I can also tell you on one occasion, he did, kind of say that he was going to stop gaming and he was going to stop designing games and stuff like that. I'm going to say around 1970, said he was going to give it all up and he was going to go further with his faith. And he did that on a couple occasions. And then, of course, literally 3 months later, they couldn't keep him away from the fanzines and from the wargaming and the miniatures and things like that. And, you'd see him back writing columns for the General and other of these early fanzines literally months later. So Gary, was a very interesting character for many, many reasons. And that was one of them. A lot of people don't know that he was a Jehovah's Witness during that period. And then sometime later in his life, somewhere after 2000 and probably closer to 2004, once he started having some real health problems, is evidently when he became really very interested in the Bible again and started reading it daily and became a very Bible believing Christian, non-denominational, but was very interested in it, signing his emails with Scripture, and was very active on various Christian message boards and whatnot.
I mean, certainly, I would say the reason I didn't get the impression he was that religious is because he was printing these books full of like naked women and demons and things like that. Did he ever talk about whether he saw any sort of conflict there, or?
He did. As a matter of fact, he was always very clear that he always tried to separate his gaming entirely from his faith. He never wanted something faith-oriented to show up in his game, and kind of vice versa. He tried to keep them separate but equal, if you will. So it's a really, again, he's a really interesting character for many reasons, because he clearly was a man of many, many weaknesses, and many, many strengths. But his faith has always been somewhat enigmatic, and I would be lying if I said I figured that out about him, other than to say that I think it's just very interesting that the same guy that was being accused of Satanism, actively promoting Satanism, was a guy that, at least for a long period of time, was quite faithful, to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then much later as kind of a non-denominational Christian. I will say that from the late 70s, probably through the 80s, I'm not clear that he was very tied. I didn't find anything that would necessarily suggest that he was very tied to a faith or anything else. And this is also some of his very low points after his mother died, and a lot of kind of personal tragedy he had experienced. He struggled with a lot of things, especially when he moved away to Hollywood. He lived a pretty wild life for a while.
Well, I mean, David, you mentioned that these Satanism things were being spread by clergy and teachers and so on, but I don't think you mentioned major media news outlets, because it was like major things like the New York Times and 60 Minutes were propagating this stuff that you think they must have known better. I mean, as a journalist, what do you make of this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this was for sure a major media frenzy. As part of my research for my book, I went through and printed out like every newspaper article from the 70s and 80s that ever mentioned Dungeons and Dragons. And as a journalist, like, it's painful to read those, because you see these stories where these reporters are just feeding off of each other. So like one reporter one day wrote that Dungeons and Dragons is a game about casting spells and talking to demons, and doesn't explain anything beyond that. And then the next day you see another reporter just parroting what the guy before him wrote. And then there'll be like a case where, the kid who robbed the liquor store. When that appears in the police blotter, it'll say in the police blotter, so-and-so was arrested, police reported that they found Dungeons and Dragons books at his house. And then that just becomes part of the narrative. Like, no reporter is ever questioning, is this relevant? Like, why do we keep reporting that this kid plays Dungeons and Dragons? It's just, everybody else, has become the narrative. Every time this story is written, it's about, so-and-so, before he robbed the bank, he was playing Dungeons and Dragons, and everybody knows that, so that becomes like the story itself. So it's painful reading those. And it's interesting too, because you see the phenomenon building itself the same way as we've seen it year after year. D&D was the big bugaboo in the 80s, and everybody thought that was satanic and that was ruining our children. But, then heavy metal kind of came around and took on that same mantle. And then video games, into the 90s, people were talking about how video games were going to make kids go out and kill each other. And, things like Grand Theft Auto and Doom and games like that were going to, corrupt our children. And you can see the media frenzy building up itself each time and doing the same things, and these reporters just being overly credulous and just, not stopping at any point to say, is it really relevant that these kids were playing Dungeons and Dragons, or that these kids were, playing Doom before this thing happened? It's really a major failure, I think, on the part of a lot of the people who wrote those stories at the time.
Right, and just given what a big failure it was in terms of media and law enforcement and parents, etc., did anyone ever come forward and apologize or try to correct their record or retract anything?
No, sadly, very few. I mean, one of the most famous cases during the the satanic panic, as we call it, was that the 60 Minutes report. Ed Bradley, who was one of the most famous anchors for 60 Minutes, a really well-respected journalist, did this absolutely insane and sensational report on 60 Minutes about kids who were playing Dungeons and Dragons and how they end up getting too involved and killing themselves, or getting too involved and entering into crime or depression. And it's just, you watch it now, it's just full of errors and mistakes. And even back then, Gary and the team at TSR, right away went back to 60 Minutes and the CBS and was like, here's what you got wrong, A, B, C, and D. And even back then, they just kind of ignored him, and they ignored the people pointing out the mistakes they made, and never have revisited it, and never said, you know what, we got this wrong. All those stories are just still sitting out there. And that's what makes it even more galling when, this hasn't completely gone away. It was just I think last year, maybe 2 years ago. But, every now and then, guys like, Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell will still come out and say something derogatory about how D&D is satanic and about how it's witchcraft and you're consorting with the devil. And, they point to those old stories and, the narrative is still there. And every now and then you hear one of these stories still pops up with somebody saying something absolutely stupid and ridiculous. But because none of those, because guys like Ed Bradley never came out and said, you know what, we got this wrong, the narrative is still out there, and it's frustrating if you're a player.
And if I can piggyback that, actually, games like this, all the way back to the original war game by H.G. Wells, Little Wars, even that game drew controversy and the ire of parents. I remember reading something to the effect that peace-loving parents will not approve of this game because it will inspire war thoughts among your kids. Now, Little Wars was basically a miniatures game. It was created by the great sci-fi writer H.G. Wells, and it was just a game where he would basically just had found a system for kids to play games, and adults for that matter, to play games with, recreate battles, if you will, with miniature soldiers. And it's considered kind of the first miniatures war game anyway. And, and even back then, parents were really worried about it. And, you go all the way through, up through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. I think that the moral of the story, the headline is really that anytime something really new comes on the scene, everybody kind of panics about it. If they don't understand it, they want to suppress it. It's a really interesting tale of psychology, among other things. But I will say this, and I'm going to quote some research from kind of David and I's mutual colleague, John Peterson. I remember him writing about pointing out the fact that companies like Parker Brothers, meanwhile, are producing Ouija. And Avalon Hill is producing Black Magic, a game called Black Magic, which is actually a Black Magic set that you buy. And yet here's D&D that's being, crucified for this kind of strange esoteric game that nobody understands. So, to this day, I don't fully understand why it drew so much ire. But as David already suggested, to this day, some of these things haven't gone away. These whispers have not gone away. The game still holds a shroud of kind of controversy that I don't know if we'll ever leave it.
Well, Michael, there's this saying that there's no such thing as bad publicity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you think about that I think David was saying that it made kids want to play Dungeons & Dragons more, the controversy. Do you think overall, in the long term, the controversy did more to hurt or help Dungeons & Dragons?
Oh, there's no question. It did. It made the game legendary, and the game will last forever as a result of the controversy. And it may have anyway, but there's no question you can show it statistically in 20 different ways. The conclusion that I came to, having talked to a lot of people that, of course, who were involved in the game and involved, during the Satanic Panic, but also, in this case, people from Random House who were working with distribution of D&D, and I mentioned that for a specific reason. So, at the same time that the first big controversy broke out about D&D, which, of course, was the James Dallas Egbert III episode. This is a kid at Michigan State University who disappears mysteriously one day. He was kind of an outcast as a kid, kind of a classical geek, if you will. He's in college 2 years early. There was a whole list of things that were going on in his life. He disappears, and he happens to play role-playing games. And, of course, what happens is a private detective comes in, William Deere, and suggests to the media and others that maybe he was playing this game, Dungeons & Dragons, and that he lost his mind. Because one cannot separate It basically grazed the line between the real and the imaginary. And this gets out, and this really becomes the first major controversy that gets national attention. The reason I mention that, and that happens in late August, early September of 1979. At the same time this is all happening, D&D is striking up a distribution agreement with Random House. So in aggregate, what happens by, say, mid-September of 79 is that the same game that's getting all of this national press for having this weird mystique around it about, wow, kids play this game and they start going insane. This is what happened to this Egbert kid, who by then, by the way, was found, and it had nothing to do with Dungeons & Dragons. It was the same game that started appearing on shelves at every major bookstore and toy store because Random House had distribution in all these places. So the answer to the question is that there is no question that these controversies, the first of which being the Egbert affair, absolutely propelled the game to a level of visibility and stardom that it never probably would have or could have had before. And that was the proof in the pudding was the revenue of TSR within roughly a year's time from when that started. Went from about $2 million to $8 million. It quadrupled, when before that they had kind of consistently been doubling, and not even quite that. So, I mean, there's no question that, as you say, all press is good press in this case. And while that controversy propelled the game to new heights, it kind of almost forever kept it out of the mainstream also.
I mean, so like I said, as a kid, I didn't know a whole lot about what was going on with TSR, but obviously I was aware of the Satanism controversy. And I also had this vague sense of other controversies where fans had mixed feelings about the company. I remember hearing this joke that TSR stood for They Sue Regularly. David, do you want to talk about that? What was that? Was that joke earned by the company, the TSR?
Yeah, it kind of was. I mean, it's one of the ironies of TSR and of sort of Gary's, life as a businessman is that, the game started out as such a collaborative effort, that it was, growing out of these war games, and that it was, these people in the Great Kingdom kind of coming up with this idea for building fantasy worlds, and everybody's building on each other's work. But then once the game is published and is a product and starts making a lot of money, TSR was really strict about other people doing anything that looked like Dungeons and Dragons, doing anything that said the words Dungeons and Dragons in it. So, they cracked down on people who wanted to make outside supplements, who wanted to have, a list of monsters that might work for you inside of Dungeons and Dragons. They cracked down on similar games that sort of also were in that fantasy environment. There was a lot of lawsuits threatened. There was, a decent number of lawsuits actually filed, but mostly it was just a lot of threats. I mean, you had this upstart company that was suddenly making a lot of money and had the money to hire lawyers to send out a nasty letter, and the nasty letters are going to small independent game publishers, which are almost always just some guy in his basement, after work, chasing his passion and writing his own rules and trying to share with his friends. And, other people that were doing exactly the kind of thing that Gary was a couple of years ago are now, their enemy number one. We don't want these guys publishing a product that's going to compete with Dungeons and Dragons.
Well, it almost seems like Gary Gygax created a monster because he eventually became one of these small developers who kind of got sued out of existence by the company he had created.
Yeah, I mean, there's more irony there. I mean, Gary eventually, the story of what happened at TSR and how he ended up losing control is a really complex and interesting one. I get into that in my book, and so does Michael. But yeah, once he's gone, he doesn't own the game at all. He has no rights to Dungeons and Dragons, but this is what he's famous for. Everybody knows him as, the Dungeons and Dragons guy and wants more of the same from him. So when he tries to launch new game companies to make new games, TSR, with a new owner now, definitely does not want that. And so they really shut down his first couple of efforts, post Dungeons and Dragons, to have his own game and do his own thing. The same way, he once shut down other people. They were like, no, you can't do anything that even looks remotely like Dungeons and Dragons because we own that now, so we're going to stop you from doing your thing.
Well, and Michael, do you want to add anything to that? Because I guess one of the things I did hear as a kid, too, was that I heard when the second edition came out that there was some woman in charge of TSR, and I think I heard she had kicked out Gary Gygax, and she had only released the second edition because she wanted to make money, and she didn't like gamers. I heard sort of weird rumors like that. Do you want to comments on, like, how fair would you say that perception among fans was?
I mean, like anything, it's a major oversimplification of what's an otherwise very complex reality. Second edition, there's no doubt. Well, firstly, so Lorraine Williams, when she took over the company, to suggest that she was kind of doing it all out of spite, I think that's a little strong. I mean, she was a businesswoman, and thought she was making good business decisions, and she didn't like Gary. I mean, there's no doubt they butted heads very early on and became kind of arch enemies, I think, pretty quickly, which is, of course, ironic because Gary brought her into the company to help manage it once it had really been through a lot of financial turmoil. And he was trying to kind of stabilize this thing. And in the midst of all of this, she actually takes over the company, buys out Gary's partner's shares, and ousts him in essence. But, when you start getting into some of this later stuff and some of the later litigation between the two, and, and TSR, as David already suggested, was an extremely litigious company everywhere, even from its earliest days. As soon as they really could hire lawyers, they started hiring lawyers to start sending C&Ds. And of course, they learned this the hard way. They learned it because they were the victim of many, many C&Ds and other types of action from like the Tolkien estate and a lot of other people that they had ripped off previously. That was kind of normal. They basically grew out of a tradition of homebrew games, of basically getting photocopied and other types of reproduction artwork for their games they would put on these fancy, So this was kind of the thing they're growing out of. And then, of course, once they became a real company and they start really retailing games and making money, there's a lot of people that are looking over their shoulder and saying, "Hey, this is our intellectual property." And of course, early versions of D&D have things like hobbits and balrogs and things like that, Tolkien characters. So those things, of course, later changed. So that's kind of how, you might suggest that's how TSR learned it. And of course, this is the Wild West of copyright law for role-playing games. Just like the early days of video games, judges and lawyers didn't really know what to do with this stuff. Was it art? Was it science? What is this? Of course, the copyrights themselves you could protect and you could try to kind of you could get your head around it a little bit, but a lot of this stuff was really abstract. So you cut ahead to when Gary is ousted much later, and then of course he starts getting into trouble with, as you already suggested, the monster he created, pun intended, I'm sure. And I think that it is largely what happened is that, of course, once Lorraine takes over, she needs to protect her interests, the interests of TSR, and that was business as usual. But of course, she starts getting into litigation with Gary that, I'm not a lawyer, but some of it seemed like it was a stretch, that Gary couldn't do any fantasy role-playing game. There are certain things Gary did that were certainly shots across TSR's bow. And I'll give you one, for example, is that once he, a few years later after he leaves TSR, and he teams up with Games Designers Workshop, and he makes a game called Dangerous Dimensions, which is, I don't think, coincidentally, also called DD or D&D. So, I think it was going a little bit both ways, but these people didn't like each other. That was very, very clear. And I think at the end of the day, I think Gary very much got the short end of the stick, I think, on a lot of these things, especially post-TSR.
Right. Well, you mentioned that these guys like Gygax and Arneson were gamers, not businessmen. But Lorraine Williams was a businesswoman, and nevertheless, the company went bankrupt, I don't know, within a decade or so, right? What do you make of that?
Again, that gets to some pretty complex. Well, no, I don't know if it's all that complex. I think one thing that, as you say, Williams was a business person, but she wasn't a gamer. So one thing you would say is that from the very top, you could argue that there was kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of the whole culture. Whether she actually disliked gamers, who knows? I know that was always kind of the rumor, and I know Gary has said as much. But there was certainly probably a misunderstanding of the culture to a certain extent. If you didn't grow up with it, after all, it would be kind of hard to understand this otherwise esoteric community. And then I think you pair that with a lot of very suspect business decisions, and bad luck too. I think there was a lot of ebb and flow. TSR did a lot of great things after Gary left also. There was a lot of very successful campaigns they released. There was some products that were actually kind of on the surface quite successful that kind of quickly pulled the company down just because they couldn't keep up. They really kind of diversified in very weird ways, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And really, the dagger in the heart of TSR at the end of the day was that they had this distribution agreement with Random House where they were selling fiction. They were selling fiction books, which was an extremely successful business model for them for a long time. It all started with the Dragonlance series of books, which were all bestsellers. And I think TSR started to lean a little bit too heavily on these fiction books. And of course, books are returnable from the publisher. So I think they basically, TSR overproduced by a long shot. They had a huge, multi-million-dollar return of books that they couldn't sell. And that was kind of the nail in the coffin. There was a lot that happened in between, but there was many, many suspect business decisions that you could argue they just didn't have their finger on the pulse of what was really happening in the gaming community.
What's funny, you mentioned that they did good things after Gary left, because I got into Dungeons & Dragons with 2nd edition, and so it's just kind of strange to think that all these things that I loved so much were being produced by this company where it sounds like the employees were quite unhappy and there was so much dissension, and I don't know, David, how should I feel about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Lorraine Williams gets a lot of criticism and is really painted as the bad guy in all these stories because Gary was so beloved and because, she was the person responsible for his ouster. A lot of people there at TSR didn't like her. She was not a gamer, so there has been this whole legend built up of like, oh, Lorraine came and ruined the company and it was all crap after Gary left. But that's really not true. The company did a lot of stuff after Gary left that was really successful. One of the things that I think Lorraine deserves a lot of credit for, so I interviewed her for my book. She doesn't talk to people much, but one of the things I found interesting talking to her was, I was like, you're not a gamer, why did you want to take over this company? And she explained it as, well, her real interest is reading and literacy. She comes from a newspaper family, and the reason she had the money to buy into TSR is because her father was the guy who first syndicated and owned Buck Rogers, the comic strip. So it's an old newspaper family, very much built around reading and words. And she initially saw Dungeons and Dragons, and she saw this as, wow, there are kids all over the country playing this game. This company publishes books. They're books of rules, but this company publishes books, and kids devour them. So her interest in the company was largely that. She's like, I loved seeing kids read. And I was like, we can do some really interesting stuff here and get the kids involved. And I think to her credit, one of the things she did right when she was at the company is D&D really built out their literary efforts. And all the great Dungeons & Dragons novels that are still big and popular today, Robert Salvatore and his Dritz series, the Dragonlance series, all those from Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss, all those books came out under Lorraine Williams' reign as CEO. And she doesn't deserve all the credit for that. I mean, it was guys like Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss and Bob Salvatore. I mean, they did the work and created this brilliant stuff. But she was in charge of the company, and it was a big focus of hers to publish more books, to build up the kind of stuff, the product line that TSR was doing and focus more on things like that. And so I think she deserves more credit. It's like, yeah, a lot of stuff that you love about D&D was Lorraine's stuff. Dritz is like the most popular character, period, in the Dungeons & Dragons world. And if you love Dritz, that's not a TSR creation under Gary Gygax. That's a TSR creation under Lorraine Williams.
Right. Well, so I mentioned then TSR goes bankrupt and they get acquired by Wizards of the Coast. Do you want to talk, David, about just like what do you make of the Wizards of the Coast reign over Dungeons and Dragons?
Well, it's a complicated question. I think it's absolutely been net positive. The first version that Wizards of the Coast published on their own, and Wizards of the Coast at the time they were a little gaming, well, not so little at the time, but they were a gaming startup of their own. This was a company that published Magic the Gathering and made tons of money off of the card game. And so they had all this cash, and they had an owner, Peter Atkinson, who was a big gamer and who loved D&D and loved role-playing games. And that's why they came in to buy the property from TSR when it was crashing and burning, because they were gamers and they loved it and they wanted to make games. So I think it was really great that the game was rescued by like-minded people. Their first version of the game that they published, D&D 3.0, was a really fascinating experiment. They open sourced the game. They kind of followed a lot of the same stuff that people were doing in the time in the software industry with open source software. The idea being, we take an operating system like Linux or programs, that somebody's written, and we're going to release this out to the world and say, this is the core. We own the core of this, but go and build stuff onto it. Here's the operating system. You make your own extensions. And what Wizards of the Coast was telling gamers was, here's the Dungeons and Dragons rules, but you want to publish your own adventure? You want to publish your own supplements and stuff like that? You can do so under these set of open source guidelines. And I think doing that was brilliant and really helped give some life back into the game, because suddenly, the stuff that Gary used to shut down, that there was outside independent publishers making products for Dungeons and Dragons, like now it wasn't all on Wizards of the Coast's shoulders. There was other companies that were publishing stuff and adding to the game, and that helped create this rich environment for gamers and players and helped keep the game alive. Subsequent editions were also great. My friends and I, we just finished a 3.5 edition game that we were playing for like almost 10 years. Fourth edition, some people had problems with it. D&D kind of stumbled, I think, a bit there. A lot of people didn't like the fourth edition. They thought it was too video gamey. And Wizards of the Coast has actually said, we can see what the complaints were, that we were kind of trying to respond to the rise of games like World of Warcraft. Those were maybe becoming more popular. The games that D&D gave birth to are now sort of taking over from D&D, so they were trying to model themselves a little bit off of that. But then the new 5th edition, they've built very closely in concert with gamers. They did a really long and extensive playtest with lots of feedback, both from playtesting groups, but also from dozens and dozens of conventions where thousands of people could play it. And I think they've really been successful building a new version of the game that feels like D&D and works like D&D, and people are very happy with. Beyond that, the big change is that Wizards of the Coast is now no longer this little, game company run by gamers. They got bought out by Hasbro. So now, while the game, I think, is in great shape and the new edition of D&D is really fun to play, it's an interesting situation because D&D is small potatoes when it comes to Hasbro. Like, Hasbro's got way bigger things that produce way more revenue than Dungeons and Dragons, and so I think there's a little bit of a struggle to get the company to pay attention to D&D and give them the development money and the marketing money they want. But that's sort of the future of D&D, is how it survives and prospers within this new sort of environment.
Yeah. Well, Michael, you mentioned, I think you've played most or all of the editions of D&D. Do you agree with what David was saying about the different editions? Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Absolutely. As in, I agree, and of course, I could always add something. You're talking about my favorite topic, after all. So I haven't played 5e yet, and it's funny because I know a lot of the designers. I've spoken to a lot of the designers. I love a lot of the stuff I've read about it, and a lot of it is kind of back to the basics to a certain extent, which gets me very excited because, well, for one thing, it really talks about how much they got right even very early on in the design of the game. So I've played AD&D, I've played 2nd edition, 3rd edition. As David suggested, Wizards did a great job with 3rd edition. It was really kind of revived not just D&D, but a lot of the role-playing game industry, which was really struggling at the time. And there was actually a subsequent crash after what they called the D20 system. The 3rd edition happened. But I will say that 3rd edition was a really spectacular system, and I really, really enjoyed it. 4th edition, I actually also played a little bit, and also agree with the things David is saying. It was pretty video gamey. It was not a particularly elegant system. It had a lot of strange complexity, but it wasn't hugely complex as it was just weird. I guess that's the way to put it. Complex, yes, but more weird than complex in my estimation. So I'm actually really hankering to play 5e, again, because I have so much background in it now, and I just haven't had a chance to sit down with a group and play it yet. But, for me, honestly, the stuff I like best is probably original AD&D, or I should say just AD&D. I also like 2nd edition. I probably grew up more with that than most things. And I also play other systems that are kind of D&D-like these days, like Castles and Crusades by Troll Games is one of my favorite these days. which is very similar to AD&D. So I like the kind of the older stuff, the less complex stuff for the most part. So I'm really actually looking forward to seeing how 5e has married everything together, and that's kind of what I'm hearing what it's done.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't played D&D since 2nd edition, but actually my girlfriend and I went and checked out a game. There's if anyone, I'll give them a shout out. There's a new store in Astoria called The Geekery, and they had a free game night to teach you how to play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And so we went, and I actually found, I mean, knowing only 2nd edition, I found most of the rules pretty familiar, and it really seems like a well put together system to me. So, I don't know, that was my experience. But do you want to say, Michael, what do you think kind of about the future of Dungeons & Dragons? Where do you see things going from here?
Well, I think the good news is, first, that it has a future. This game, I think, legitimately could have been left along the roadside at some point. I mean, it is the number one. It would be hard to argue that it's not kind of like the top, at least intellectual property in the world of role-playing games. That there might even be bigger companies. I mean, Pathfinder is very successful. There's a lot of things very successful these days. But, I mean, D&D is the original. So to a certain extent, it's always going to have a place. But I would posit that if the things that happened didn't happen, the game may have just been another, role-playing game that kind of just slowly died over time and just people forgot about. It was very important that the company got acquired when it did by Wizards of the Coast, and that they made the specific moves that they made at the time with 3rd edition. I think that really revived the whole thing. And as David already suggested, this whole open gaming license that they suggested, they all of a sudden invited everybody to start creating supplements and material for this game to support the system, which is one of course, the most important things you can do, is to not just develop core books, but to create support material for a system. Adventures, campaign material, this type of stuff. This is what keeps a system alive if it's good stuff. So I would say, first of all, that I'm delighted that D&D is not only alive and well, but that it just has a wonderful future in front of it. And I really couldn't guess. Again, I haven't played 5e yet myself, so I could only kind of speculate. I know the system's been very, very successful. And at this point, I would say that D&D is never going to go away. Even if it didn't stay with Wizards or whatever, I think D&D is always going to have a place in role-playing culture by virtue of the fact that it's the original and there's been so many successful versions of it. There'll always be another successful version that comes along. Maybe 6th edition won't be that great, but maybe 7th will be amazing. Who knows?
Well, and David, in your book, you suggest there's actually a renaissance in Dungeons & Dragons going on, and that people are playing it at trendy coffee shops and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think the current state of D&D is really strong. The new version of the game is lots of fun. People I've talked to who, go all the way back to original D&D or AD&D, they like the new version and people are really into it. It feels like D&D and it's fun to play. And because of, the new edition, but also because, of this sort of revival of geek culture in recent years and people sort of embracing a lot of these hobbies again, I think D&D is getting a lot of attention and just like it's cool again in a lot of ways. And you do see people playing the game in lots of interesting places. There's lots of groups that, they play in public and they meet all over the place. There's lots of ways to get involved with the game. And I think there is a real renaissance right now of just, of people returning to the game, but also people discovering it for the first time. You've got a lot of people who have heard of Dungeons & Dragons but have never played it. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that D&D kind of gave birth to the entire video game industry. And for a long time, it looked like the video game industry was going to destroy Dungeons & Dragons because video games were saying, hey, look at these awesome graphics. Why just pretend and just have these pictures in your head? We can show you what this world looks like. You can walk around Azeroth. You can have this cool multiplayer online experience. But I think a little bit what's been happening lately is that a whole generation of people who grew up playing these video games and who were maybe very into EverQuest or World of Warcraft or, other RPGs, anything from Skyrim to Fallout to whatever, they are now reverse sort of finding Dungeons & Dragons. They've played the children of D&D but never played D&D, and now they're sitting down and they're realizing, oh wow, there's something different here. This is an awesome experience in and of itself because it's social. I'm doing it with my friends in person. It's kind of like a party, and we can do things in this game that we can't do in our video games. The possibilities are as limitless as your imagination.
And you make the point that the game doesn't seem weird to people now, that everybody has now played World of Warcraft or something along those lines, and so they kind of feel at home in the fantasy role-playing setting.
For sure. I mean, think about it. What's one of the most popular TV shows in the world right now? It's Game of Thrones. I mean, you have people who maybe 30, 40 years ago would have never, read any fantasy. They never picked up a Tolkien book. But now, on those Sunday nights, they're in front of their TV. And then the next day, they're in the office talking about Game of Thrones with their friends. Like, fantasy is mainstream. From Game of Thrones to the Lord of the Rings movies. Everybody is into this idea of fantasy now. So it isn't so weird to be like, okay, yeah, all right, I'm a wizard. I know what a wizard is, or I know what a knight is, or, it's just much more accessible than it used to be. And that's helped a lot. Like I was saying, when it came to the satanic panic, it used to be back in the 70s, people would pick up those rule books and be like, oh my God, it's a spell book. But now people pick up a D&D rule book and they go, oh, this is kind of like Game of Thrones. This is awesome. I want to do this.
All right, great. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with David Ewalt, author of Dice and Men, and Michael Witwer, author of Empire of Imagination. So guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. This was fun.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to David Ewalt and to Michael Witwer for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Mrs. McLaughlin and to Arthur McMahon, who writes, "This has become far and away my favorite podcast. I recently discovered podcasts a few months ago as I first started hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, and Geek's Guide to the Galaxy helped keep me sane during the dawn to dusk amount of hiking I was doing. I binge-listened through Geek's Guide to the Galaxy's library of stellar panels and quality interviews. No other podcast has entertained and informed me on the things I am interested in. Thank you, David, for continuing to do this podcast, and I hope it keeps going for a long time. I wish I had more episodes to burn through, but I'll wait for each new episode with excitement and patience." So big thanks again to Arthur McMahon for that great review. And of course, a special thank you to Chris Taylor, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. I'd also like to thank Joe Monty, who just increased his pledge amount to $5 per episode. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd prefer to make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I'd like to thank Colin Devitt and Jason Bolton, who both just signed up to make monthly contributions to the show. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Penguin Random House for sponsoring today's show. Check out the new novel Saturn Run by John Sanford and Katine over at johnsanford.org/saturnrun.html. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.